Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings here on Now TV. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And hey, I really appreciate you being with me. Hearing more and more good comments from people who are kind of joining in for the first time. And we really appreciate the fact that we are having more and more people view our videos. Now remember, on YouTube, YouTube is just a very small snippet of the audience that we are reaching. And so if you happen to go to YouTube and watch this video, my videos there, and you say, oh, well, it's got 700, 800, 900 views. Boy, that's not very many. It's certainly not viral. Wish it was. But nonetheless, you say, well, nobody's watching. Well, wait a minute. Once again, YouTube is tiny little snippet of the audience and of the reach of Now TV. Now TV is a almost worldwide network. And so, well, I absolutely appreciate, the audience here on YouTube. Have to keep in mind, this is just a tiny bit. There's a much broader audience out there that is watching us here on Now TV. All right. Now, we are continuing our discussion of the challenge of Christ. The challenge of Christ, very simply, is, you ought to know this by now, Jesus standing in front of a crowd of enemies, men who hated him, men who wanted him dead, men who wanted to find any fault whatsoever with him, said, if I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me. John 10:37. Well, some of the works that the Father gave Jesus to do, obviously, was to come in judgment. Matthew 16:27 and 28. And he said he was going to do it in that generation. Not some far off generation. In that generation. Before everyone that died who was standing before him at that time, before all of them died. This is incredible. Needless to say, as I pointed out on this program before, atheists, skeptics, Muslims, Jews, skeptics of all sorts say, see, this is proof positive that Jesus is not the Son of God. It's proof positive the Bible is not inspired. It's proof positive the apostles were false teachers, exactly like Jesus was. Listen, ladies and gentlemen, I've said this before, I will say it again. It is way past time for the church to be able to meet the challenge of Christ. Did Jesus come in that generation in judgment and the resurrection as he said he was going to do? If he didn't, Jesus said, don't believe in him. And so what we've been doing is examining the fact that Jesus and the New Testament writers all state unequivocally that the time for the fulfillment of all prophecy had come. I hope you were able to take advantage of my special introductory book introduction of my brand new book entitled, These Are the Days in Which All Things Must Be Fulfilled. And boy, for those of you who took advantage of it, thank you so very much. All right, so what we're doing is showing the New Testament is undeniably clear about what Jesus and all of his apostles said about the time of the end. It had arrived. They were living in the last days. It was not going to be thousands of years away for the fulfillment. It was at hand, coming soon, coming shortly, coming quickly. So, how do we explain that? What we've been doing is examining the prophecy of Daniel chapter 9. 70 weeks are determined upon your people and upon the holy city, Daniel was told by the angel. 6 constituent elements are found in Daniel 9:24. to be fulfilled within the 70-week period of time, to put away sin, to make the atonement, to finish transgression. I've been sharing with you over the last several weeks how to finish the transgression meant to fill up the measure of sin. Now, last week we touched on the filling up of the measure of sin in the book of Revelation, and we've already examined how in the Old Testament it foretold that Israel would fill up the measure of her sin in the first century prior to the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Isaiah 65, Isaiah 66. We then focused in on Matthew chapter 23, and technically we also looked at Matthew 21 and Matthew chapter 22, parables of Jesus concerning the filling up of the measure of sin on the part of Israel. Listen, folks, I've got to drive this point home. This concept of filling up of the measure of sin had absolutely nothing to do with America. Had absolutely nothing to do with Russia or China and Gog and Magog, some supposed time of the end conflict. It's all about Israel and her filling up the measure of her sin and being destroyed as a covenant people so that God could create a brand new people with a new name and a new covenant. Isaiah 65, again, Isaiah 6, chapter 66, host of other passages. You see, God never intended for old covenant Israel to be his ultimate goal. God always intended to use Israel to bring salvation into the world, and all nations participate in it. Those who choose to obey. That was always God's ultimate plan. Okay, so we want to focus again today on the book of Revelation and the filling up of the measure of sin. We touched ever so briefly on Revelation chapter 6. 9 and following last week. I want to pick up on that. And in the meantime, let me tell you that I developed this concept of filling up the measure of sin extensively in my book, Who Is This Babylon? Go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com. Go to the store, just do a search for Who Is This Babylon, okay? And order the book. Now, this is for U.S. orders only. I can't do this for out of U.S. boundaries. Order the book, Who Is This Babylon? Send me a note that says you saw the offer on Now TV. I want to hear from you, okay? Now TV. And I'll refund your shipping. And again, U.S. orders only. I can't do it at all for non-U.S. orders, okay? But just know that this concept that I'm developing of the filling up the measure of sin is discussed extensively in this book, both from the Old Testament and the New, showing, number one, it is an Old Testament doctrine to be fulfilled in Israel's last days. It is not concerning foreign nations, pagan nations, filling up the measure of their sin. Let me reiterate. The 70 weeks are not about America filling up the measure of her sin. It's not about Russia. It's not about India. It's not about China. It's about Israel filling up the measure of her sin and being destroyed as a covenant people. This is so fundamentally important to grasp. So that means, ladies and gentlemen, when we come to the book of Revelation, that quotes, cites, and alludes to and echoes over 400 Old Testament prophecies, that in order for us to get the filling up of the measure of sin to refer to Rome or America or the Roman Catholic Church, We have to ignore the fact that the book of Revelation is talking about Israel. We have to ignore the fact that the book of Revelation is about the fulfillment of God's Old Testament promises made to Old Covenant Israel. And we have to be able to prove definitively that all of those Old Testament prophets and prophecies echoed in the book of Revelation were not really about Israel, even though God was specifically addressing Israel in those prophecies. And we have to then be able to prove that God was talking about these pagan nations filling up the measure of their sin and being destroyed at some yet future, quote, end of time or end of human history. Well, I touched on the fact last week, so this is where we're going to pick up where we were. We are told, and it is insisted by futurists, well, you know, the book of Revelation was written about 95, 98 AD under the reign of Domitian, who persecuted the church. Well, again, in my book, I chronicle from history, I chronicle from early Christian writers, I chronicle from the scholars, and listen, late-date scholars who are increasingly admitting that the evidence that Domitian ever persecuted the church is scant to none. Now, are there some later patristic writers who say that? Yes, but they are later. They're 200, 300, 400 years away. And they're reliant upon the testimony of Irenaeus, which, as I pointed out last week, is tenuous at the very best. It is not clear. It is ambiguous. So, nonetheless, we are told, well, okay, the book of Revelation is about Rome filling up the measure of her sin. Let me reiterate a critical point that I made last week. It took Israel literally centuries to fill up the measure of her sin, the sin of killing the prophets, Revelation 16:6, Matthew 23, 34 and following. It took Israel literally centuries to fill up the measure of her sin. Her sin would be filled up in the first century through the killing of Jesus, Matthew 21, and the parable of the wicked husbandman, as well as the killing of Jesus's apostles and prophets. Luke chapter 11, Luke chapter 13. Jesus saying, behold, or to Jerusalem, behold, I send to you apostles and prophets. Some of them you shall crucify and scourge and chase from city to city, that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth. Folks, once again, he's not talking about the Roman Catholic Church. He's not talking about Rome. And he's certainly not talking about New York City or America. Stephen in Acts chapter 7, standing in the temple, an extremely short time after the day of Pentecost. The day of Pentecost in which Peter said, you, that's that audience standing there that day, you have taken and by wicked hands have crucified and slain the Son of God. Acts chapter 2, 29 and following. Actually about, verses 26 and following. So Stephen, just a few days after that, standing in the temple, and he castigated his audience and he said, which of the prophets have you not slain? Who's he talking to? Representatives of Israel. So this is so critical to understand, ladies and gentlemen. Look, I was raised believing, I was raised being taught, I was raised teaching. The book of Revelation is all about Romish persecution of the church. Well, the Roman Catholic Church didn't exist for several hundred years after Revelation was written. So, Houston, we have a problem here. We have a chronological problem. How could the book of Revelation be about the future filling up of the measure of sin on the part of the Roman Catholic Church when Revelation is talking about Babylon, the Roman Catholic Church supposedly, was already guilty of filling up the measure of her sin? Not one day would be, but Revelation chapter 17 and verse 6, John said, in describing this great harlot city, she was holding a golden cup full of the blood of the prophets and of the saints. Sorry, doesn't work. So, in my time remaining today, let's develop how neither the Roman Catholic Church, nor Rome, nor literal Babylon in Iraq, nor America could be Babylon. Now remember, Babylon is the city guilty of all of the things that we're going to talk about today. Rome is the city that was guilty already of doing the things that are described in the book. And here is a succinct point. There's only one city, there's only one entity in all of human history. Okay, not just in the book of Revelation. There's only one city in all of human history and in all of biblical history specifically that was ever guilty of doing the things that Revelation describes Babylon as, number one, having done, and number two, of doing and filling up the measure of her sin. What are those things? And again, I developed this extensively in my book, Who is This Babylon? Point number one, Revelation chapter 16, verse 6, in describing the impending fall of this great city Babylon in the pouring out of the seventh bowl of God's wrath, the angel says, "Righteous and holy are you, O Lord, for you have avenged on her the blood of the prophets." Paraphrasing. Okay, wait a minute. Babylon killed the prophets. Now remember, as I've already noted, the book of Revelation quotes, cites, alludes to, echoes over 400 Old Testament prophecies. So what prophets do you think Revelation 16 might possibly be talking about? It's not New Covenant prophets. And here's an interesting statistic for you to consider. In the New Testament, the term the prophets and the anarthrous, simply prophets, is used over 90 times. Anytime, please catch the power of this. Anytime that you have the term the prophets or prophets without a contextual qualifier that tells you who those prophets were. Ephesians chapter 4, when he ascended up on high, he led captivity captive, and he gave gifts unto men. And he gave some to be apostles and prophets. What's he talking about here? Apostles and prophets in the church after the ascension of Christ. In other words, these are new covenant prophets. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, 25 and following, 21 and following. God set some in the church to be prophets. In the church. Very clearly not talking about the old covenant prophets here. However, when there is not a contextual qualifier that tells us, well, he's talking about, he's talking here about the church. For instance, in Acts chapter 11, 28 and following, there arose a prophet. Now, this is in New Testament times. This is after the establishment of the church. But there arose a prophet who said that there was about to be a famine throughout the whole world, which was fulfilled in the reign of Claudius. Okay. New Covenant prophet. Philip the evangelist had 7 daughters, all of whom were prophetesses. Well, Philip was himself a prophet. His daughters were prophets in the church. And again, ladies and gentlemen, this is so critical. Let me reiterate the point. When we find in the New Testament a reference to prophets, whether it's be unauthorized, which means without the definite article, or when it's used with the definite article, if there is no contextual qualifier that tells us who these prophets are, like in Acts 11, Ephesians 4, 1 Corinthians chapter 12. When we don't have that contextual qualifier, the prophets in view are inevitably and undeniably, in all such cases, Old Testament prophets. Well, guess what? In Revelation chapter 16, there is absolutely no contextual qualifier to tell us, Babylon is the city that was killing the New Testament prophets. Well, they did that, or she did that, but late, perhaps under Nero. But ladies and gentlemen, Nero and Rome never, ever killed an Old Testament prophet. Never. I was on a radio talk show program years and years ago, and it was a call-in show. Never will forget this. And we had a caller in, very nice guy, and he said, I want to take issue with Mr. Preston's view that Babylon was Jerusalem. So I asked him why. And he said, well, it's literal Babylon in Iraq. And I said, well, I don't think that's going to work because Revelation chapter 16, verse 6, Babylon, whoever that was, Babylon killed the Old Testament prophets. And I went through the evidence I've just presented to you here as well. So I posed a question to this individual. I said, so let me ask you to name one single Old Testament prophet that literal Babylon in Iraq ever killed. And he goes, oh, well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I said, wait a minute. Let's talk about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Daniel chapter 5. The king of Babylon did his very dead level best to kill them. He heated the furnace up 7 times greater than normal, threw them in there, and as I made comment on the radio program, I said, they didn't even get a sunburn. And the gentleman, the caller in, he just kind of laughed. He said, never thought about that. I said, well, what about Daniel? Daniel was thrown, in the lion's den. These are ravenous lions. They're ready to eat. And they didn't even so much as lick Daniel to get a little taste. And he goes, well, I got to admit, I never thought of that. And so I went ahead to make a comment on the program as I'm making here. Ladies and gentlemen, point number 1, in Revelation chapter 16, there is absolutely no contextual qualifier that would allow us to identify these prophets who had already been slain, by the way. These are prophets who had already been slain prior to the writing of Revelation. Rome never killed an Old Testament prophet. Period. End of story. Now look, ladies and gentlemen, if you are going to identify Babylon in Revelation as the Roman Catholic Church, you got to prove that the Roman Catholic Church kills some Old Testament prophets. Well, again, since the Roman Catholic Church did not exist until long after the passing of the old law, therefore, after the time of the Old Covenant prophets, guess what? Babylon of Revelation cannot be the Roman Catholic Church. Since, as just noted, since literal Babylon in Iraq never killed an Old Testament prophet, even though she really tried, then Babylon of Revelation cannot be, the Roman Catholic Church or literal Babylon. Rome, as already seen, never killed an Old Testament prophet. Rome didn't exist at the time of the Old Testament prophets, except for a very short period of time. But she didn't kill them. Do you see the problem here, ladies and gentlemen? On this point alone, and more directly to the point, Nero, obviously, as the emperor of Rome, never killed an Old Testament prophet. Never. Domitian never killed an Old Testament prophet. Therefore, since Revelation is about the time of the destruction of Babylon that had killed the Old Testament prophets, this completely, totally, 100% eliminates Rome as being Babylon of Revelation. It just doesn't work. Okay, that means that Rome is not the city guilty of filling up the measure of her sin and about to be destroyed. And I'm out of time for today. We'll pick it up next week with point number 2 that I want to make. I'll see you then.